to Long Blue Leadership, the podcast where we share insights on leadership through the lives and experiences of Air Force Academy graduates. I'm Navir Walkowitz, class of 99. My guest today is Chad Hennings, class of 88. Chad learned the value of hard work, trust, and integrity growing up with his parents in Iowa. From the fields of Iowa to the skies over Iraq, Chad's journey took him from the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he earned academic All-American honors and won the Outland Trophy as the nation's top lineman, to flying 45 A-10 combat and humanitarian missions in the first Gulf War. It was only after fulfilling his commitment to serve that Chad entered the National Football League. He was 27 at the time, and went on to win 3 Super Bowl championships with the Dallas Cowboys. Today, Chad continues to lead from the front. He's a speaker and he's authored several books, including It Takes Commitment, Rules of Engagement, and Forces of Character. He founded Wingman Ministries and is a principal in Rubicon Representation, where he helps businesses grow through meaningful relationships and synergy. He's also the host of his own new podcast, Forces of Character, where he shares stories of moral courage and principled leadership. In this episode, Chad and I are exploring what it means to lead with purpose, character, and commitment in every arena of life. Chad, welcome to Long Blue Leadership.
Hey, Navir. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. We're so excited, and we love to just kind of jump in. One of the first things I found so fascinating was, yes, you served after the academy, but you had a big decision to make because you had an opportunity that not many do coming out of the academy. I think it's only over 1%. A very small percentage of people can go on to play in the NFL, and you didn't. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, that was probably one of those crossroads in life where, you learn aspects of what character, what virtue is at the Air Force Academy. And then when it's put to the test, that's where you got to truly decide, do I own this? Is this a part of who I am? And am I going to live this out? I was drafted in the 11th round, which just goes to show how old I am because there's no longer 11 rounds in the NFL draft. I was drafted by the Cowboys. I was at one of those crossroads where did I want to try to play in the NFL? See, back then, there was never an option like the elite athlete program that they have now where someone can go immediately if they have a contract to go play their individual professional sport. Back then, this was untrodden territory. So for me, there truly really wasn't an option. I mean, for me, I wanted to fulfill my commitment. I raised my hand to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I took that commitment. I made that commitment serious, but it was one of those things, Navir, that in my head, I knew I needed to fulfill my commitment, but in my heart, I wanted to go out and play football, wanted to see if I had the right stuff. What kind of adding insult to injury a little bit, I went to Shepherd Air Force Base for Euronato program for pilot training, and I would receive Gil Brandt, the Cowboys Hall of Fame player personnel director, would send me and, for my buddies tickets to go down to games in the fall down into Dallas, because the base was only an hour and a half, 2 hours away. So 50-yard line seats, sideline passes. And I would see those guys in my draft class playing in the NFL, Michael Irvin, Ken Norton Jr., a couple of the names to note. And man, it was really tearing me up. And it was one of those things that for me, I had to make a decision that I'm going to fulfill my commitment. And ultimately, it worked out for me. Well, I'll put back up. It literally took me several months, if not a year, to get comfortable with the fact that this is my calling. This is what I'm going to do, to be fully committed to being the best officer, the best fighter pilot, the best eventually A-10 fighter pilot that I could be. And, I guess God had different plans, and it was worked out that in 1992, when our armed forces were going through the reduction force, they waived the commitment, not just for pilot training, but not enough individuals were getting out. So they waived 2 years off of our service academy commitment, which then allowed me to again go into the NFL. And truly, Navir, my claim to fame is, how fast life can happen to an individual. I flew my last mission in Northern Iraq in 92, and I played in the Super Bowl the same year. That's how fast the transition. But I mean, there's a lot of stories, that can going into that as to how that ultimately happened, being able to come back because the Cowboys had changed ownership, Tex Schramm And the Cowboys ownership, Jerry Jones, had bought the team. So did they really know who I was? And there was a whole bunch of stories behind that, which we probably don't have time to delve into. But for me, it was a pivotal moment in making the choice of, do I choose to be the individual that I profess to be that individual character that was going to keep my commitment? And ultimately, that's what I chose. But it wasn't easy. I mean, I was tested mentally, that temptation to compromise. And, in all transparency, there were other NFL teams that had offered me money to lawyer up to try and get out of the commitment, similar to what kind of goes on today has happened in the past. And I'm like, no, that's not me. That's not who I profess to be. And it all
Wow.
worked out in the end.
Well, when did you know that about yourself? Does it go back to kind of growing up as a boy in Iowa, seeing kind of that work ethic and that decision-making quality from your family, from others around you? When did you know that about yourself, or was it developed at the academy?
It was my parents instilled me that aspect that once you start something, you never quit, that you're in for it for the haul. And I think for me, particularly football, is the best leadership laboratory that there was, where you learn the aspects of commitment, resilience, overcoming obstacles. Hard work does pay off ultimately in the end, all those different traits. And then for me, that's what it was I didn't want to quit. I gave my word. I was committed to it, and that's, was certainly reinforced at the Air Force Academy. And I counseled with Coach DeBerry, with my other coaches, with, my teammates. Ultimately, and in all sincerity, it was difficult for me to make the decision, even though my commitment was basically waived, not just for me, but across the board for everybody. I felt I was almost giving up on the Air Force, going to play for the Cowboys. I struggled with that. And that's where I saw it, counsel from Coach DeBerry, from, my squadron commander, uh, my fighter weapons off. I mean, a variety of individuals, my former teammates at the Air Force Academy. Am I quitting this? But ultimately I came to the conclusion that I could do more for the Air Force by playing for the Dallas Cowboys than I could, staying in the cockpit, going on to be, following on a career in the Air Force, which ultimately it was. Because I make the case that when, John Madden or Pat Summerall, that if I made a tackle or a sack in a game, they'd circle me on the teleprompter and they'd say, Chad Hennings, Air Force Academy graduate, former E-10 fighter pilot, makes the play, and it's marketing and advertising dollars for the academy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that goes without saying. I'm curious, in that kind of journey. Obviously, you have to have you make these decisions based off of, you look at everything, right? Like, who am I? Am I, grounded in my morals? And then how am I making an impact with this decision? I'm curious, if we can kind of roll back the clock a little bit, maybe either when you're growing up or at the Air Force Academy, was there a time where it was tested, right? Like, these are major decisions you made going into the NFL, or, getting out of the Air Force early from being a pilot in the A-10 Thunderbolt 2. But were there some other lessons along the way that had kind of built up that decision-making quality for you?
I think for me, it wasn't, any significant event. It's always been a series of events. Because for me, it's, living that life of excellence. It's not a destination. It's not something that you arrive. It's a journey. And for me, it was those little things. One example, or helping that decision-making process, was even getting into pilot training. Most people would see me from a physical stature standpoint, at 6'6", now it's still probably way too much, 275 pounds, was the maximum truly waiverable height and weight to be able to fly. And for me, they allowed me to go. And for one of those reasons, I can remember going through pilot training 2 weeks after I was flying the initial jet trainer, the T-37. The wing flight surgeon, or Colonel Christensen, came up to me and said, "Chad, we had to actually go back and check the design specifications of the ejection seat. We're not sure if you cleared the tail, if you ever had to punch out of the aircraft. All it's too heavy for it at that time." And I'm like, okay, well, thank you for share time on that one. But, the funny story is you adapt. My instructor pilots would brief, if we're in a controlled ejection situation, it's for those pilots out there, it's an oxymoron for a controlled crash. And we'd go to a controlled boil area, roll the aircraft inverted upside down, then pull the ejection handles, so you adapt. Then flying, in pilot training too, the T-38, I can remember sitting for my first ride was an instrument ride, and I was so confined in the cockpit that my legs started to fall asleep. And I'm sitting there trying to fly a precision approach, banging on my quads, feeling back in my legs. And then, for me, the principles that I basically learned with that is that, sometimes being a leader, you're put in uncomfortable situations. And sometimes, to accomplish the greater good, sacrifices must be made, and that you have to set the example for others. I guess, I could have one more example. I guess when I was playing for the Cowboys, one of those seminal moments too would be, I can remember a time when I was as a seasoned veteran, I would lead workouts, grass drills in the off season. And we had a young rookie that was perpetually late to these workouts all the time, grass drills, going out and kind of working on our skill set. And I remember one time, because he was doing that, he was trying to emulate other veterans that it was kind of very Orwellian, that all animals are created equal, some are more equal than others. In regards to that, they weren't leading by example. They took their privilege, their prestige, and were doing things. And he thought that, hey, I'm a rookie. I haven't paid my dues, but I'm going to live that type of lifestyle and do that. So as he was late for a couple of these grass drills, I finally told him, turn around. You're not going to participate. Get back in where you can learn to be here on time, to set the example for the others, for your other teammates. Then you can come back. And that's where I learned that as leaders, we got to set the example. It's not just what you say, it's what you do. And truly leadership, leading from the front, is modeling that behavior. So those are just a couple examples that I can think of that, for me, were kind of seminal moments and what it means to be a leader.
Right. And that wasn't only in leading others, but you probably had seen that modeled from others previously. Was that something that you learned from coaches or others?
I learned that the best that I had was my older brother, Todd. As a young man, he set the bar for me of, if you want to be excellent in something, you have to be willing to pay the price. And that included in the weight room in the off season. He was a couple years ahead of me in school. He was the quarterback. I was the tight end, and I had to run routes for him. And he drugged me to all the weights, as a young incoming freshman in high school. He set the bar for me regarding what it takes to live excellence, and that the price is paid in the off season. It's not just paid in the game, it's paid in the off season. So for me, it was all about the preparation, the hard work, that ethic. And then for me, it was always, my parents were phenomenal, but I had phenomenal coaches. And for me, I think the greatest moniker that I could place upon someone is call them coach. And I've had some phenomenal coaches in my life, and several coaches. For me, former superintendent Mike Gould, I coach Coach Gould, because he was seminal for me to get into the Air Force Academy. He recruited me. And then also he was very instrumental for me getting my waiver to be a coach into pilot training. So he had a huge impact on my life, and I owe Coach Gould a lot.
I can certainly understand that and appreciate that. Have you had the opportunity for others to call you coach in that way? Obviously, a little bit different in roles, but have you had that same kind of title, so to speak, for others that has really kind of fulfilled you?
Most certainly. I can relate, and we may get into this later, but I think it may be a great segue, is, we've all gone through different phases in life. Who I am today is not necessarily who I was in my teens and 20s, nor my 30s and 40s. And now that I'm approaching the big sixth decade of life here, different. And I make kind of an athletic or a sports analogy as to the different phases in which we live. And this will help you with regards to being called a coach. Me being called a coach. When I was in my teens and my 20s, I compare that like to being a freshman on a team or a rookie. You're trying to figure out the offense, the defense. You're trying to make a position. You're there and you're just trying to figure out life. And that's the same thing for teams. You're trying to get that first job or graduate from college. You're trying to learn your business, figure out aspect. Can I make the team? Can I fit in? Then when you're in your 30s and kind of your 40s, now you're that vested veteran. You're that upper class. You're that individual that has been there, but you realize that for me to succeed, even as an individual, the team has to succeed. So I need to help elevate the success and the play of others. So now you're kind of that player coach. Then as you get to my age in your 50s and your 60s and beyond, you've kind of been there, done that. You've gone and you've achieved the quote unquote success or the material wealth and all this. And then you realize that life, for me, as defining excellence, it's not about material wealth, gain, fame. It's about relationships. And now it's being that coach, where now I elevate others. And it's, for me, doing those one-on-one mentorship sessions or the discipleship stuff as a Christian, helping out other young men walk and figure out their identity, their purpose. That, to me, brings more joy than anything, but is because, I've learned through the different phases that I've lived through.
Well, that actually leads into one of my questions that I think is really fitting because, you talk about as you have time and experiences, you know your identity, you know who you are and why, what your purpose is. What advice as a coach would you give to some developing leaders that maybe are struggling with what their leadership identity is and who they are because they don't necessarily have all of the experience quite yet?
The number one thing is, that's actually one of the questions that I ask someone that is changing and transitioning in their careers, whether that be from professional athletics or from the military. I ask them, who are you? A lot of times they'll say, I'm Captain so-and-so, or I'm a former F-16 fighter pilot, or I'm a former running back, whatever. I go, no, that's what you do. Who are you? What you do does not define who you are. And that's the thing that I think so many people need to grasp, is that their identity is not based on what they do. It's more of an inner pursuit. And for me, it goes to the faith-based aspect of my identity is based upon the reality of the filter in which I view the world, how I perceive, my vision, how I perceive my thoughts, my words, and my actions that provide that meaning, purpose, and impact around me. And for me, it's that I'm, as a man of faith, it's kind of, put in the best analogy, is what sits on the throne of your heart. What truly defines you, who you are. That can be any type of, it could be politics, it could be environmentalism, it could be your faith, it could be whatever. That's what sits on the throne of your heart. And for me, that's how I react to my world around me, my environment, the garden in which I'm planted, how I try to make it bloom is to impact the lives of others. And that's what I'm called to do.
Did you know that fairly early on, like when you were, flying your 45 missions or wearing the uniform, whether it's the Air Force uniform or the Dallas Cowboys uniform? Did you already know that about yourself, that your identity, or has that been developed over time and understanding?
I wish I had that as my identity back then. No, it was learned, and unfortunately, so many of, well, at least for me personally, the lessons that I have learned have been through my struggles, through obstacles that I've had to overcome, pains, and I learned that with the health of my son Chase. Just quick background on that: after we had just won Super Bowl 30, or third Super Bowl in 4 years, my son ends up having a reaction to a childhood immunization, and he ends up developing an autoimmune illness where we didn't know whether he was going to make it or not. And for me, this was the first time in my life that I couldn't control an outcome by my own work ethic, by my own intellect or physical ability. And I was at this crossroads of life of, who am I? And, God, who are you? And what can I do? And this is where that really began to strip me of what my perception of reality was in regards to myself. And, really put me on this trajectory was reading a book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, the logotherapy, the aspect of why. Why do you do what you do? And finding that why helps in so many different ways. And then, I've certainly climbed to it, working with the individuals at the Centers for Character Leadership Development, from Joe Sanders to Kevin Basic and a variety of other individuals that have made a big impact on me over the years of just encouraging me to read different things and to explore different things. And, from an identity perspective for our listeners, I think it's probably one of the most scariest places to be, but one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself is to be inside your own head, to truly question what your motives are and why you do what you do. And when you can answer that truthfully, not from a facade, but from a truthful standpoint, then you're well on your way of kind of figuring out that aspect of identity as to who you are.
Thank you for sharing that. Do you think that that kind of understanding is developed only when you have those kind of critical moments of having to overcome something? Or can that be experienced and learned maybe just through listening through podcasts like this or other ways?
Well, I think you can. I don't discount. You certainly can learn things through that, but the aspect of ownership, and this is where we may dive into this later, that I say character is kinetic.
Yes.
And that's the aspect for me as a Christian too. It's your faith. Your faith, if you don't use it, you lose it, sort of thing. And that's the same thing with character, that the more you use it, the more kinetic, the more you're fine tuning that muscle through learning, through overcoming obstacles. The same thing with leadership, the more fine tuned and the more it ingratiates into who you are as a person, into your being, that it becomes second nature. It's muscle memory at this time. And that's where, as parents, and this is what is so frustrating to see at times, particularly this last generation of individuals, where don't want our kids to suffer. We don't want our kids to have to struggle. We want to make life easy for them, and we don't allow them to experience life in its fullest. We're not
Give them scar tissue.
Yeah, we're not preparing them for life, and that's where I alluded earlier, the biggest lessons I learned in life were through either my mistakes, my inability to overcome, and my struggle. That's how I developed resiliency. That's how we all develop resiliency. And unfortunately, there's no shortcuts.
Right. Well, you talk about character being kinetic. And so that means, there are times when you are acting out of character, are not in alignment with where you're trying to, or, like you said, you're not working that muscle. Can you share a story about, when you were in that, and then how do you, get your mindset right where it's like, I need to get back on track? How can you coach someone through that situation?
I think how we don't know what we don't know. And that's where we're always, as fighter pilots, check your six, what's behind you. Sometimes I can't see what's behind me. And that's the same visual picture of us regarding our character. And sometimes our perception of reality, quote unquote, is not reality. And that's why we need strong relationships of individuals that we surround ourselves with, that we trust, that are willing to provide feedback or willing to call out behavior in us that, is not who we profess to be. And, I've happened that all the time. And that's one of the reasons I started a men's ministry called Wingman. I mean, it's just for that aspect of mutual support of going through life. But from the individual standpoint, one of the things that I was fortunately exposed to as a young man, because of my affiliation with Dr. Dennis Waitley and the psychology of winning, like a Zig Ziglar, he was one of the early guys adapting, positive self-affirmations and visualization. I used to visualize, some people call it chair flying. That's what it was exposed to when I was going through pilot training, of actually closing my eyes, visualizing going through different motion. I used it predominantly in athletics as a young man growing up, but it's also that aspect of visualization of who I am as a person. Do I profess this? Where I would play through my mind different scenarios of engagement, communicating with others. You can use it in a variety of different ways. But for me, that was instrumental in honing my identity and my character, because reading something out of Viktor Frankl, then I would visualize, how does that apply into my own life? And how can I extract different truths as they apply to me, and visualize different scenarios as to how either I've misused it in the past or how I can continue to use those traits and those principles going forward.
That's fascinating. And I think that's really a wonderful way to take like something that you heard someone else do or you read about. And you just talked about earlier, one of the most uncomfortable places to be is in your head. But actually, when you do it that way, you're able to see how effective am I being, or what can I do better? And so maybe that might translate to character is kinetic, but would you also think leadership is as well?
Oh, very much so. Everything that you can visualize and you can apply that just by thinking through different scenarios, how different things are going to play out. If I approach my group this way, how will they react based on the personalities that are in that organization? And I have affiliation with the Center for Brain Health or Brain Performance at UT Dallas in Dallas, and Dr. Sandy Chapman had always talked about, what is true intelligence? The true intelligence is not necessarily rote memorization where you're regurgitating information, but it's the ability, how do you think integratively, strategically, innovatively? And I think that's where, when I finishing that, is how can I, to your point of learning from different seminars or reading books, is the ability to take that principle and apply it to your life. And that's where we're talking about leadership in this particular instance, is just that. Learn a leadership principle. Okay, how can this apply to me in my group today based on this example where you just play through different scenarios, think through different outcomes. And it's the aspect that you're taking more mental reps now. So when it actually happens, muscle memory, it's ready to, and you're able to react and not necessarily, you'll be able to be proactive and not just have to react on the fly where you got a 50-50 shot of getting it done right.
Right. And I imagine that you saw that come into play, whether it was on the gridiron or in the cockpit. Can you share an example of where your leadership was tested in a way where those mental reps helped you? Like maybe to share a story in which some of our listeners might be able to gain some experience through yours.
Um,
There's probably many examples.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of something that is most applicable, but it would be, from a business perspective on leading a young person to getting them to realize, say they're in a sales position, that it's not about them. They want to get their sales commission, so they were thinking about, how can I serve my client where I'm going to get the biggest benefit. And that's not what you're talking about, from a leadership perspective. Okay, let's walk through this scenario of how you can be a salesperson where you're doing what's best for the other person. It's not about you. And it's trying to get them to change that perception of what they have and lead them to that performance where then they have that aha moment. They realize that they did what's best for their client. They were compensated for it, and that it's the best way. They feel better about themselves all in the long run. So, for me, that, from a real world example would probably be the most applicable, but there's many others regarding, the biggest thing I've heard about leadership, is I'll reinforce again, is just that it's not so much you say it, but do you lead it? Do you model it for everybody else? And that do you show that care? Do your people that are underneath you under your purview of leadership, do they know that you care? And do you know more about them, their families, their children, their grandkids, whatever they might be? Do they, things that they're struggling with in life? That to me is what, truly defines leadership. It's not just say, hey, follow me, boys, let's take this hill. Well, it's getting to know your people and knowing what makes them tick too.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you've shared, how you've led through different roles. I'm curious in moments of transition, because I think a lot of our listeners as well are either transitioning out of the military, or maybe they're at that crossroads, like where you were, right? When you still wanted to serve, and where can I make that greater impact? What advice might you share with them in going through kind of those transition moments? What should they be thinking about, and how might you navigate that for them?
Again, that first thing of that aspect of identity, you got to get identity straight first and foremost. And that's probably the most difficult one, because it's foundational to everything else that you do. If you don't have a clearly defined identity, then, decisions you make are being made in a vacuum, basically, depending upon, whatever job you're in what the markets are doing, maybe what, different relationships, what the weather's like, what, your physical health, where it's the aspect that it could be a short-term gain, but long-term pain, that you're making the decision, not what's best for the long run, but just to get out of this pain moment right now. Because that aspect of identity, who you are is set in stone. It does not change, that concrete. And it doesn't matter what you do, because who you are is consistent throughout. And that's what I would encourage, our listeners today, is just that. And, I've had conversations with individuals who have gotten out of the military, 06s, 07s, and and when they get into that, they're no longer around that sense of camaraderie, esprit de corps that they experienced in the military, and that single sense of purpose. They get out, it's in a civilian job, and it's a totally different culture, totally different mindset. They question who they are. And this is the thing, is that when you get out there, are you going to conform to the culture, which may not be the direction that you want to go, or are you going to, stay true to who you are? And, like the Ash conformity experiment, I'm not get too geeky out here, but, I call it always the 80-20 rule, where in that experiment, they found that 74% of the population would compromise, tell lies to be able to fit in with a group, just so that they would be a part of that tribe or that group. There's only 26% of the people would stay true to who they are. And I mean, that's a huge indictment on on us as humans. And that's the thing, is don't be willing to compromise who you are just to fit in with the group. You'd be the change of culture. You be the impetus for having others follow you. You be that stalwart when it needs to be that, because there's a lot of people that are willing to follow, but they're willing, they want to follow somebody that they respect, that whole prestige bias, and be willing to go. They want to be led, put it that way.
Is that what inspired you in the transition from NFL to kind of what you've been able to do in building communities and sharing your words through your books and your podcast? Is that how you got into that? Just realizing, like, this is my moral compass, this is my purpose, and now I want to help others understand it?
I did that out of a selfish need, because I realized that my transition, I didn't have that. I kind of struggled through after the second transition, after the NFL, into the, here it was, as an Air Force officer, I was told what to do, where to go. This is the mission. We're going to go this way. In the NFL, we're working, same thing. Playing football, we're going to work towards winning Super Bowls. Now, when I'm on my own, it's a scary feeling that I can do whatever I want. You mean I'm not told what I have to do. I can be whatever I want to be. I'm like, okay, I have these different abilities. What is that? I don't know. And I experienced that. And that's why I share what I share, because I know on relationship based is that I want to help others so they don't have to they can be self-aware of their own shortcomings or who they are as individual, that they can navigate more effectively than what I did. And that's why, out of a selfish means, I created those things, because I realized it's not about me. I need a team. I need to surround myself with others that will edify who I am, will help be true to me in regards that if I am screwing up, they will be honest with me and call me out. And then, help me to be the best husband, father, friend that I can be.
What did you learn about yourself in that process where you didn't really have, the path forward? What did you learn about yourself as a leader in that major transition?
I think it was, still back to that aspect that I need to set the example, that if others want, that if I want others to follow me, one, they have to respect, and I have to be true to that aspect of what I profess is the vision and the mission that we're going down. That was the biggest thing, is to walk it out.
So I imagine you had, your team in the football team with the Air Force Academy, obviously the Cowboys, your military team. Let's talk about your family. Let's talk about your family team and the roles that you each play in elevating each other. Can you share how that is working in your household?
Yeah, it's been a learned process too. I wish I could say it's all been awesome, but no, one of the biggest things that, my wife and I, we made a commitment years ago, particularly when our son was going through what he went through early in our marriage, is that we made a commitment that no matter what, we're going to stick together. We're going to be true to each other. Because that's when parents have a child that at the death of a child or even a significant illness, the divorce rates are way above norm. So we made the commitment that we were going to be one, and then as co-CEOs, we, setting the vision for our family. What does it mean to be a Hennings? Who are my kids? Who do we profess them to be? And then as parents, we came to the realization too that our job was not just to care and nurture for our kids, but it's to train them and to equip them to be responsible, God-fearing American citizens that make a difference in the world. And, to find out, what does it mean to make a difference? It's what is your calling? Who are you as an individual? What's your sense of purpose, your identity? To walk them through that. And then, my kids, I am a grandpa now. I have a grandson.
Congratulations.
Now 13 months old, but I see in my daughter and her husband, picking up lessons that we shared with them throughout how they're training their son. So for me, from a legacy standpoint, my sense of excellence, the relationships, that's what I pass on. It's not monetary benefit. It's that aspect of character, leadership from a family perspective, and what that entails. And it's getting, my whole thing was to get my kids to own who they were. That when they're off to college on their own, it's not mom and dad that are going to, be telling them what to do. They're on their own. So that is to prepare them for those times. And what do you do when? We taught our kids the visualization thing too of, like you're at a party, whatnot, and there's kids that are drinking. Are you going to drink and drive? How are you going to be the designated driver? What decisions do you make along those lines? Go through it, play the scenario out in your mind right now, because when you're in that, you haven't thought through that process, again, 50-50 shot of doing the right or the wrong thing. Know who you are immediately.
I think what's so rewarding about hearing that is, you talked about if you could go back in time, maybe you didn't say this, but what I inferred was, you would have loved to know who you were sooner, right? Your identity, but you helped instill that in your children. I think that's wonderful. And do you see them doing that with your grandkids already?
Yes, very much so. And, my daughter is she's kind of more like her dad in that way that she kind of nerds out on brain science and psychology and motivation and social psychology. And she, she's trying out different things. Not that my grandson's a lab rat, right? He starts with me.
I didn't take it that way.
Yeah, but there's universal truths that she's instilling in him that I'm proud. And it's like she's doing just what her mom and her dad showed her, taught her. So that's awesome.
That's fascinating. And that's wonderful too. One of the things we like to share with our listeners is this. Can you tell us what's something you do every day to be a better leader?
What I do every day, which for me, being as a man of faith, as a Christian, I do a daily devotional. My first fruits every day that I give. And I read through scripture, and because that reminds me again who I am, what my vision is, what my identity is, and who I'm created to be. So for me, that sets the tone, the bar for the rest of the day. And everything else beside that is, it's just doing work. And again, one of the best pieces of advice that I got was through going through the Center for Brain Performance with Dr. Chad. She talked about the power of two, power of one, power of none. And it's easy to remember, but the power of two was then when you're hunting elephants, you don't go down rabbit holes. So you have two things that you concentrate on a day. And that's like taking 15, 20 minutes. Again, how do you think innovatively, integratively? Do something creative. And for me, that's what I do through scriptures, or do it through journaling or reading something that's going to elevate me in my performance. That's the tone that you set. Because those are the two things. Everything else is emails, answer emails, phone calls. That's just minutia. And then the power of one, do one thing at a time. Don't multitask. So finish at one thing, because multitasking increases cortisol levels. It actually decreases brain performance. And then the power of none. 5 minutes, 5 times a day, sit and just allow your brain, it kind of mimics REM sleep, is to categorize and just wherever your brain wants to go through, just allow it to go. Don't listen to the radio, don't listen to music, don't read, but just take 5 minutes. Do I do this all the time? No, but I try to do this. But what that does is it helps your brain be confident or be the most efficient that it can be. And that's something that as a leader, to be my best self, I realized that I have to do those things to take care of myself physically, getting a right sleep, dieting, exercise, doing all these things. And it's not just the X's and O's of what you say and how you communicate and the vision that you set to your employees. You got to take care of yourself first and foremost, because if there's no you, you're not a leader, right?
That's right. So I wonder if that actually might answer this next question, but I want to give you the opportunity to expand if so. But what is something that you would tell a developing leader or someone who maybe even a seasoned leader to do today that will help them be a better leader down the road?
I think for me, what's huge is always mindset. Motivation, why you do what you do. And it's that aspect of, like Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, is do you have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset? And for me, it's the aspect of growth mindset is that, again, being a leader is not a destination, it's a journey. How can you constantly improve in all facets of holistically who you are, individual? How can you improve health, diet, exercise, continue to better yourself, rest? But then how do you improve also from a character perspective, from a leadership perspective? What are things are you doing to hone that skill? Because again, if you don't use it, you lose it. You constantly have to be in that personal growth mode or you stagnate and eventually you wither away and die. And that's even happens after you retire, after your professional career is over, you still need to be in that personal physical growth mode.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I really enjoyed was reading your books, Forces of Character. And in there, you interviewed Troy Aikman. And one of the quotes he said was, "Without integrity and without character, I just don't believe you can lead at all." And I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
It's a true statement because, again, if you're those who you're trying to lead or those that you lead, if they don't trust you, if they don't have faith that you are the person who you profess to believe to be, why are we going to follow you? So character and integrity are essential aspects to any leader.
We're going to ask for Chad's final thoughts next, but before we do, I'd like to take a moment and thank you for listening to Long Blue Leadership. The podcast publishes Tuesday in both video and audio and is available on all your favorite podcast apps. You can follow us at longblueleadership.org. So, Chad, I want to make sure we have time to cover anything else that's really important to you or things you'd like to live with our listeners, especially regarding leadership, because I've learned so much and I really appreciate your sharing who you are because you know so clearly. So what else might you offer for our listeners?
What I just want to be an encouragement to those folks, either as grads or others that are listening in, is that, we are all called to be leaders in some capacity. And that whether that's, as a teenage kid, making a personal decision, hygiene decisions to take a shower, use deodorant or not. I mean, everybody makes is a leader in some capacity. And I just want to encourage them that to take that aspect with sincerity, because there's many times that I don't know the impact that I'm having on someone, but because of my actions, maybe words that I said in a public setting impacted somebody in a positive way. And for me, that's what it's all about, is impacting people. It's all about relationships and impacting those people, and you never know the impact that you're going to have in the long run. So leadership is proactive. Get out there and be intentional about what you do. And it doesn't stop after retirement, after, transitioning different jobs. You can continue to be a leader in many facets of your life.
Thank you so much for taking the time today, Chad.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Until next time, I'm Navir Walkowitz, and this is Long Blue Leadership. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Long Blue Leadership. The podcast drops every 2 weeks on Tuesdays and is available on all your favorite podcast apps. Send your comments and guest ideas to us at socialmedia@usafa.org and listen to past episodes at longblueleadership.org.